Okay, so we're going to start off by just reviewing what we did last time with the factorial typology. This was kind of a lot of material. It's really bringing together all the things we've been doing in the class so far. And so here I've sort of broken it down into different steps, where first we're going to figure out the distribution of the sounds in question in each specific language. If we're only doing one, then we're just going to do one. Maybe we're doing more than one. Then we're going to figure out the necessary contextual markedness constraints. If we have context-sensitive kinds of distributions, then we'll figure out what kind of general markedness system is required. And finally, we'll figure out which faithfulness constraint is going to be relevant, and then put them all together into a grammar. So let's start from the beginning here. So in the last example, we looked at the distribution of anteriority in strident fricatives across a bunch of languages, and some possible distributions. I've listed 3 of them here. There's also the 4th sort of boring one, where you just don't have any contrast for the feature in question. But beyond that, we have a sort of free contrast, or what I've been calling separate phonemes in this class. And so, for instance, if we look at the English data from the last handout, we're going to map out, hey, where do we find the anterior fricative, and where do we find the non-anterior one? And for each of these, if you can't immediately see the answer, you'll want to make a table with the preceding context and the following context. And so if we do this for English, we'll find a whole bunch of minimal pairs, like sin, where it's preceded by a word boundary and followed by an I, and shin, where it's preceded by a word boundary and followed by an I, and then we'll find like sock and shock. Right? And this is pretty much all we need to know at this point. If you can get the same context for both sounds, or you can get both sounds in the same context, then it means that this feature is not phonologically predictable, it's unpredictable, and therefore contrastive, right? So we already have our answer here. That's sort of maybe not the hardest distribution to characterize of the ones we've been looking at. So let's look at a slightly more complicated example. Let's say Korean, right? So in Korean, the data from the last handout, let's see, the first word here is sol, so we're going to have a word boundary, an ah vowel. We have subak, so same thing except with a different vowel. What else here? Kyosa, so preceding vowel, following vowel. Sen, seng, so, sorry, what vowel was that? Oh, an A vowel. So I'm just listing out all the contexts in which this plus anterior fricative occurs. And then for friend, we have bashi. So here we're going to be preceded by a schwa and followed by an E vowel. Yesan. Shijan. So here word boundary, high front vowel. Shik. So preceded by a nasal, followed by a high front vowel. Shi, so we already have that context, I'll leave that. Koraslu. And sot. And so at this point, maybe it's apparent that there's something funny going on here, because there's really no generalization in the preceding context at all. But here, all the cases we have of sh are followed by a high front unrounded vowel, and we never find that in here. This is a good indication that the 2 sounds are in complementary distribution, because in any context where you can find one of them, you can't find the other, right? That's what complementary distribution is. And of course, you might be able to just look at the data and instantly see what's going on here, but if you can't, this kind of a table is a good way to figure it out. Okay, so we've now assumed done this for several languages, and we're going to need to figure out some contextual or context-sensitive markedness constraints. So in Korean, for instance, we found that you can't get this sound before this vowel. And similarly, we could also say that you can't get this sound, the sh sound, before any of these vowels. Right? But one of these is going to make a much better natural class than the other one. This is a whole mix of back and front, high, mid, low, rounded and unrounded vowels, whereas this is just a high front unrounded vowel. Right? So this is a better natural class, therefore probably makes more sense to write the context-sensitive markedness constraint for this one. Now, in some cases, this kind of asymmetry won't be so obvious that either, you might run into a case where either context is a perfectly good natural class. In that case, you can just pick whichever one you like. In this case, it's clear that this is going to be a much easier specific context to look at. And so we're going to need to formulate a constraint that explains which sound occurs in the target context. Namely, it's always the minus anterior sound here, never the plus anterior sound. So we would make a constraint that says don't have a plus anterior coronal fricative followed by a high front unrounded vowel, or something like that, which I've abbreviated star C in the tableau just for readability, but these of course are standing in for natural classes of consonants, right? Another example we looked at was the English example with complementary distribution of oral and nasal vowels. And we saw there that there were no oral vowels before a nasal consonant and no nasal vowels, before a non-nasal consonant or at the end of a word or before a vowel or something like that. So again, one of those contexts is much easier to state in terms of natural classes than the other one is, namely before a nasal consonant is pretty clear, before some other kind of consonant or a vowel or a word ending is a much less clear set of contexts. So we're going to let that one be the elsewhere context. In the constraint itself, we're going to single out the context before a nasal consonant and say don't have an oral vowel there. Right? So that's what that last markedness constraint is. Again, both of these cases of allophonic variation or complementary distribution have relatively clear asymmetries where one context is very simple and the other one is pretty clearly elsewhere. That won't always be the case. Sometimes they'll both be clear contexts and you can pick whichever one you like in that situation. Beyond that, if we're doing sort of more than one language, which we often will be in this class, we're going to need to also figure out what kind of a context-free or general markedness constraint is required. In these cases we've been looking at, this is always going to correspond to whichever context we didn't single out in the previous step. In other words, it's elsewhere. Right? So for instance, in Korean, we saw that this is the specific context we're going to address for the context-sensitive markedness constraint, and all this other stuff is going to be elsewhere. Right? So which segment appears in the elsewhere context? Well, only the plus anterior one occurs elsewhere. The minus anterior one can't appear there, and so we're going to want to penalize, in the general case, non-anterior coronal strident fricatives. Right? We can abbreviate this one star esh, again standing in for a natural class of segments. And so in this example, as well as the English one, the general markedness constraint is going to target the value that we didn't single out in the previous step. Right? So here we singled out the plus anterior fricatives in the specific context, so we're going to want to single out the non-anterior fricatives elsewhere. In a few cases that we'll look at, these actually won't be about opposite feature values, but we'll get there later. For the moment, this is what's going to work. It sort of depends whether what the conditions are in the elsewhere context, right? For the nasality case, for instance, with nasal and oral vowels, we singled out oral vowels in the context of a following nasal consonant. So elsewhere, right, where you don't have a following nasal consonant, we need to mark nasal vowels. So in the general case, English doesn't have nasal vowels except before a nasal consonant. Okay, so we now have our context-specific and our general or context-free markedness constraints, and then we need to figure out which faithfulness constraint is going to be violated if we collapse the distinction between the sounds in question, right? So if we did have a C in our input, and we had to change it to she in order to conform to this constraint, what would it violate? Well, usually it's going to be whatever feature you're looking at here. So in this case, it would be ident anterior. Right? If we neutralize oral and nasal vowel contrasts, then we're going to need to penalize changes to the feature nasal, ident nasal. Right? In general case, figuring out the faithfulness constraint won't be the trickiest part here. Now that we have three of these constraints, we can follow the ranking recipe, as I'm calling it, from this Kocher text to get the distribution that we're working on. So we started with a phonemic or free contrast distribution. This was the case of anteriority in English, and for that one, we would want full contrast, number 5D here. And so we mark the faithfulness constraint, ident anterior, above both markedness constraints, star C and star sh. That ensures that, well, yeah, maybe these structures are marked at some level in the grammar, but because keeping our anteriority values from the input is the most important priority in this grammar, it really doesn't matter what these constraints say. We're always just going to keep whatever feature value we started out with. In other words, we're going to have contrasts. Right? For Korean, on the other hand, which is up here on the board, we said that this was allophonic variation or complementary distribution. Here we're going to need the context-sensitive markedness constraint ranked high. So that's this guy. The context-free one ranked below that. It's this guy. And then faithfulness ranked low. When faithfulness is ranked low, it means that these sounds can't contrast anywhere in the language. In other words, the feature is phonologically predictable everywhere. And that's true. That's exactly what we're finding in these tables. But also, we have a context-sensitive phenomenon that forces changes to the feature because this context-sensitive constraint is the highest ranked in the language. Right? So this is how we would do this. In Korean, the most important goal is to never have a plus anterior fricative before E. Right? Never have this fricative before E. The second most goal, if we're not before E, is to not have a non-anterior fricative, right? Everywhere else, we don't allow this one. Right? And then the lowest goal here is to keep your input specification for anterior. We know that Korean doesn't do that because there are no contrasts for anteriority. Right? So we can plug these three constraints into these ranking recipes and derive any of the phonological distributions that we've looked at so far. And that, in a nutshell, is what we were doing with factorial typology. And in the next section, I'll talk a little bit more about what kinds of predictions we can get out of these typologies.